The story of Søren Kierkegaard begins, not in a lecture hall or a bustling cafe, but in the quiet, narrow streets of Copenhagen in the winter of 1813. He was born on the first day of February, the youngest of 7 children, to Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, a wealthy, devoutly Lutheran merchant, and his wife, the gentle and pious Ane Sorenstat Lund. Michael Kierkegaard was a man of iron principles and fierce intellect, a man who ran his business with the same rigor he applied to his faith. He kept a strict household, one where the daily rhythm was marked by prayer, scripture reading, and the unrelenting expectation that each child would become a good Christian and a respectable citizen. In that environment, young Søren learned early that the world was a place of obligations, of duties that could not be ignored, and of a moral order that seemed both immutable and demanding. From the moment he could walk, Kierkegaard was a child of paradox. He loved the stories of the saints, yet he was fascinated by the dramas of the theater. He adored the rational clarity of his father's business ledgers, yet he was drawn to the swirling, emotional currents of romantic poetry. This inner tension would later become the engine of his philosophical work, the very tension that he would describe as the dizziness of freedom. But before we arrive at that phrase, we must trace the pathways of his early education, his formative relationships, and the intellectual climate that surrounded him in 19th-century Denmark. Kierkegaard entered the University of Copenhagen in 1830, at the age of 17, to study theology. The university was a crucible of ideas, a place where the dominant philosophical current was Hegelian idealism, a system that proclaimed the absolute unfolding of spirit through dialectical synthesis. Hegel's master science promised that history, reality, and thought were all parts of a single, rational whole, moving inexorably toward a final, harmonious synthesis. For many of Kierkegaard's contemporaries, Hegel's system was a comforting map of the world, a way to reconcile faith with reason, tradition with progress. Yet for Kierkegaard, the very idea that all contradictions could be resolved in a higher unity felt like an erasure of the individual's lived experience. He sensed that Hegel's grand narrative glossed over the concrete anguish of the single person standing before a choice. At the same time, the Romantic movement was sweeping across Europe, and Denmark was no exception. Romanticism celebrated subjectivity, the power of feeling, the mystery of nature, and the creative imagination. Poets such as Adam Oehlenschläger and poets of the Danish Golden Age sang of the soul's yearning for the infinite, of the sublime found in the everyday. Kierkegaard absorbed these currents, and they left an indelible imprint on his own style. His writing would later be marked by lyrical intensity, vivid metaphors, and a poetic sensibility that set him apart from the more systematic philosophers of his day. Yet perhaps the most immediate religious influence on Kierkegaard was the Danish pietist tradition, a movement that emphasized personal piety, heartfelt devotion, and the necessity of an inner transformation. Pietism, with its focus on the inner life and the conviction that true Christianity required a lived, existential commitment, resonated deeply with the young theologian. He found in pietist preaching a call to authenticity, a demand that faith be more than doctrine, more than ceremony, but a lived, trembling relationship with the divine. 2 thinkers in particular shaped Kierkegaard's emerging thought. The first was Johann Georg Hamann, the German magician of the absurd, a critic of Enlightenment rationalism who argued that reason alone could never capture the fullness of human existence. Hamann's insistence that language, feeling, and faith were inseparable from reason struck a chord with Kierkegaard, who would later echo Hamann's claim that the rational is not the only way to the truth. The second influence was Friedrich Schleiermacher, whose theology attempted to bridge the gap between the rational and the religious by emphasizing the feeling of absolute dependence on God. Schleiermacher's idea that the core of religion is a feeling, a sense of being thrown into the world, provided a conceptual foothold for Kierkegaard's later analysis of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. It is within this tapestry of familial expectations, academic rigor, and religious fervor that the first major anecdote of Kierkegaard's life unfolds, a love story that would become a cornerstone of his existential thought. In 1840, Kierkegaard met Regine Olsen, a young woman of striking intelligence and beauty, at a social gathering. Their connection was immediate, and within a few months they were engaged. For a man who had spent his youth wrestling with abstract ideas about duty, freedom, and the nature of the self, Regine represented a concrete possibility of a shared life, a partnership that could embody the ethical stage of existence that Kierkegaard would later describe in either/or. Yet the very notion of commitment also forced him to confront the abyss of choice. Kierkegaard's diary entry from March 1841 reveals the depth of his inner turmoil. I am torn between the love that calls me to the ethical and the higher calling that summons me to the religious. If I marry, I will be bound to the finite, to the world of everyday responsibilities. If I remain single, I may devote myself wholly to the infinite, to God. He believed that his engagement would become an obstacle to his higher purpose, that the love he felt for Regine could become a seduction that would keep him from confronting the ultimate anxiety of standing before God. In a moment that has become legendary, he broke off the engagement in October 1841, writing Regine a heartfelt letter in which he confessed that he could not, in good conscience, marry her while his soul was still seeking the absolute. The breakup was not a simple personal tragedy. It was a lived illustration of the existential dilemma of choice. Kierkegaard later reflected that this decision allowed him to experience the anxiety of possibility in its purest form, the awareness that every decision opens a horizon of unchosen possibilities, each carrying its own weight of freedom and dread. The second anecdote, perhaps less romantic but equally consequential, concerns Kierkegaard's public clash with the Danish church over a pamphlet titled The Moment, Der Augenblick. Published in 1855, the pamphlet was a scathing critique of the complacency Kierkegaard perceived within the established church. He argued that true Christianity demanded a moment of decisive, personal commitment, a leap that could not be mediated by institutional rituals or clerical authority. In The Moment, he wrote, the church has become a theater where the faithful merely rehearse the drama of faith without ever stepping onto the stage of the actual, living decision. The pamphlet sparked a heated controversy, leading to a series of polemics between Kierkegaard and the clergy. The church, defending its doctrinal authority, dismissed his accusations as mere religious melodrama, accusing him of sowing discord for the sake of personal notoriety. Kierkegaard, undeterred, responded with a series of letters and essays that underscored his conviction that the institutional church could not substitute for the individual's encounter with the divine. These two episodes, the heartbreaking dissolution of his engagement and the bold confrontation with ecclesiastical power, are not isolated biographical footnotes. They are the lived crucibles in which his concept of anxiety was forged. In his seminal work, The Concept of Anxiety, Begrebet Angst, published in 1844, Kierkegaard explores anxiety not as a pathological symptom, but as a fundamental ontological condition of human existence. He writes, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, a phrase that has become a cornerstone of existential thought. To understand how his life experiences shape this definition, we can examine two concrete passages from the text. First, in the opening chapters, Kierkegaard describes the original sin, not as a historical event, but as the moment when the human being becomes aware of the possibility of non-being. He says the original sin is the possibility of the possibility, the anxiety that the human being feels when it realizes that it can choose not to be. This formulation echoes the personal crisis he faced when deciding whether to bind himself to Regine. The anxiety he felt was not merely fear of loss, but the awareness that his freedom opened a realm of unchosen possibilities, each a potential sin against his higher calling. The very structure of the argument mirrors the choice he confronted, to marry the ethical or to remain single the religious, each path laden with its own existential risk. Second, later in the book, Kierkegaard discusses the dread that accompanies the awareness of one's own finitude, linking it to the theological concept of the moment where the individual must decide before God. He writes, the anxiety that arises when the soul stands before the infinite is not a symptom to be cured, but a signpost pointing toward the possibility of the leap of faith. Here, the language of The Moment directly recalls his pamphlet's critique of the church. The anxiety is not a defect but an invitation, a moment of decisive authenticity that the church, according to Kierkegaard, has long suppressed. The intellectual climate of 19th-century Denmark provided both the scaffolding and the opposition to Kierkegaard's ideas. The Hegelian establishment, represented by professors such as H. Martensen, argued that the dialectical process would inevitably lead to a harmonious synthesis, effectively neutralizing the individual's anguish. Romantic poets, while celebrating subjectivity, often idealized the self in a way that glossed over the darker edges of freedom. Pietist clergy, meanwhile, emphasized piety, but tended to conflate religious devotion with moral conformity, leaving little room for the unsettling experience of anxiety. Kierkegaard's work can thus be seen as a rebellion against three prevailing currents: the rationalist optimism of Hegel, the aesthetic idealization of Romanticism, and the complacent piety of institutional pietism. Yet his contemporaries were not uniformly dismissive. Some, like the literary critic Georg Brandes, later praised Kierkegaard's psychological depth, but during Kierkegaard's lifetime, many dismissed his writings as the ramblings of a melancholic theologian. The most vocal critics were the clergy themselves. In a sermon delivered in Copenhagen in 1845, Pastor Niels Thomsen denounced the concept of anxiety as a dangerous glorification of despair, a seductive lure that drags the faithful away from the comforting certainty of the sacraments. Thomsen's accusation that Kierkegaard was indulging in religious melodrama captured a widespread sentiment. That anxiety for the church was a symptom to be soothed, not a philosophical insight to be explored. From the modern scholarly perspective, another line of criticism has emerged. Some psychologists and literary scholars argue that Kierkegaard's preoccupation with anxiety reflects his own personal pathology, perhaps a depressive temperament amplified by his broken engagement and lifelong sense of alienation. The eminent scholar Paul Tillich, writing in the mid-20th century, suggested that Kierkegaard's anxiety is more a symptom of his own existential crisis than a universal condition. More recently, contemporary philosophers such as Stephen R. L. Clark have pointed to Kierkegaard's obsessive self-scrutiny and his tendency to dramatize his inner turmoil as evidence of a neurotic disposition. They contend that his philosophical system is, at best, a sophisticated rationalization of personal anguish, and at worst, an intellectualization of mental illness. These counterarguments, however, often overlook the way Kierkegaard explicitly frames anxiety as a structural feature of human freedom, not merely a personal feeling. In The Concept of Anxiety, he writes, "Anxiety is the dizziness that occurs when the self stands before the infinite possibilities of its own freedom." This is a claim that transcends the particularities of his own biography. Moreover, his method of indirect communication, employing pseudonyms, literary irony, and layered narratives, suggests a deliberate strategy to distance the philosophical content from the author's personal life, precisely to avoid the reduction of his ideas to mere autobiography. To see the continuity of his thought, we must turn to his other major works. In Either/Or, Kierkegaard, through the pseudonym Victor Eremita, presents two life views. The aesthetic, embodied by the hedonistic diary of a seducer, and the ethical, embodied by the reflective judge. The tension between these stages mirrors the tension in anxiety between freedom and dread. The aesthetic stage revels in the immediacy of experience, refusing to acknowledge the anxiety of choice, while the ethical stage embraces responsibility, thereby confronting the very anxiety that Kierkegaard describes as the dizziness of freedom. The same dialectic resurfaces in Fear and Trembling, where the figure of Abraham is presented as the knight of faith who makes the leap in the face of the absurd. The anxiety that Abraham feels when he is called to sacrifice Isaac is not a pathological fear, but an existential moment that reveals the paradox of faith. Another illustration of Kierkegaard's claim that anxiety is the signpost pointing toward the possibility of the religious stage. When we examine the textual parallels, we find that Kierkegaard's language in anxiety often echoes the motifs of his other works. For instance, the image of the swinging pendulum that appears in Either/Or as a metaphor for the aesthetic's vacillation resurfaces in anxiety as a description of the self swinging between the finite and the infinite. The self is like a pendulum that, when released, swings toward the abyss of possibility, trembling in the space between what is and what might be. Similarly, the leap that defines the religious stage in Fear and Trembling is reinterpreted in anxiety as the decisive act that transforms anxiety into faith. Only when the self makes the leap into the unknown does anxiety cease to be a paralytic dread and become the very ground of authentic existence. The historical context of Denmark's intellectual life also provides concrete examples of how the broader cultural currents appear within anxiety. First, the influence of Hegelian dialectics is evident in Kierkegaardian discussions of the synthesis of anxiety and sin. He writes, "Anxiety is not simply the negation of sin, it is the synthesis that brings the possibility of sin into the consciousness of the self." Here, the Hegelian pattern of thesis-antithesis-synthesis is turned on its head. Instead of a harmonious resolution, the synthesis is the unsettling awareness that freedom itself is the source of both possibility and dread. Second, the romantic emphasis on the individual's inner world surfaces in his poetic descriptions of anxiety as the night wind that whispers through the soul, a metaphor that captures both the beauty and the terror of solitary reflection, reminiscent of the Romantic poet's fascination with the sublime. Kierkegaard's engagement with Hamann and Schleiermacher also finds concrete expression. Hamann's critique of the Enlightenment's over-reliance on reason appears in Kierkegaard's insistence that anxiety is the irrational side of the rational. He writes, "Reason can calculate the possibilities, but it cannot feel the vertigo that accompanies the knowledge of those possibilities." This is a direct echo of Hamann's claim that the heart knows what the mind cannot grasp. Schleiermacher's notion of religion as feeling of absolute dependence is transformed in Kierkegaard's description of anxiety as the feeling of being thrown into the world, yet still yearning for the absolute. The text of Anxiety thus becomes a synthesis of these earlier influences, reshaped into a uniquely Kierkegaardian framework. Let us pause for a moment and consider the broader implications of this concept of anxiety in everyday life. Imagine a modern student standing at the crossroads of career choice, medicine, law, art. The sheer number of possibilities can trigger a sensation akin to Kierkegaard's dizziness. The student feels a tightening in the chest, a sense that any decision will close off other possibilities forever. In Kierkegaard's terms, this is not a pathological panic attack, it is the very condition of freedom. The anxiety is the signal that the self is confronting its own capacity to choose, that the world is not a deterministic machine, but an arena of open possibilities. The student's experience becomes a living illustration of the dizziness of freedom, a concrete echo of Kierkegaard's 19th-century analysis. A second example can be found in the realm of artistic creation. A painter faced with a blank canvas may experience a profound sense of anxiety, not because of fear of failure, but because the empty surface represents the infinite range of potential forms. The painter's hand hovers, trembling, aware that each brushstroke will irrevocably shape the work. This moment of hesitation, this swinging pendulum between possibilities, is precisely what Kierkegaard describes when he says, "Anxiety is the trembling of the self before the infinite possibilities of its own becoming." The painter's anxiety, then, is not a defect to be eliminated, but a necessary condition for authentic creation. These contemporary illustrations demonstrate that Kierkegaard's analysis remains relevant beyond the theological debates of his era. His insight that anxiety is the existential price of freedom invites us to reconceptualize what we often treat as a purely medical condition. It suggests that rather than merely seeking to suppress anxiety, we might learn to recognize it as a compass pointing toward authentic decision-making. Returning to the historical narrative, it is worth recalling a lesser-known anecdote that further illuminates Kierkegaard's relationship with the Danish church. In 1843, a pamphlet titled The Moment was not the only public dispute he engaged in. Earlier in 1842, he anonymously published The Old and the New, a critique of the state church's reliance on old doctrines that, in his view, stifled the individual's encounter with God. The church responded with a series of sermons denouncing the dangerous individualism of Kierkegaard's thought. In one such sermon, the pastor declared, "If the individual is to be the sole arbiter of his own salvation, we shall descend into chaos." Kierkegaard, ever the provocateur, replied in a private letter to a friend, "Chaos is the price of authenticity. Conformity is the price of mediocrity." This exchange underscores the way his personal confrontations with institutional authority fed directly into his philosophical articulation of anxiety as the tension between the individual and the collective. The interplay between personal experience and philosophical insight also appears in Kierkegaard's use of pseudonyms. By attributing different perspectives to characters such as A, the aesthetic, and B, the ethical, he creates a literary laboratory where the reader can witness the same anxiety expressed in multiple registers. In Either/Or, the aesthetic's diary of a seducer revels in the momentary thrill of conquest, refusing to acknowledge the deeper dread that follows each fleeting victory. The ethical judge confronts that dread head-on, recognizing that each choice carries the weight of responsibility. This structural technique mirrors the way anxiety operates. It can be ignored, suppressed, or faced, each approach yielding a different mode of existence. When we examine the reception of the concept of anxiety over time, we find a trajectory that moves from scandal to reverence. In the immediate aftermath of its publication, the work was largely ignored by the academic establishment, dismissed as a theological pamphlet. It was not until the early 20th century, when existentialist thinkers such as Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre began to explore the notion of being toward death and existential angst, that Kierkegaard's insights were rediscovered. Heidegger, in his lecture, What is Metaphysics?, famously quoted Kierkegaard's line, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom," using it to illustrate the human's thrownness into the world. Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, would later refer to Kierkegaard as a precursor of existentialism, acknowledging the central role of anxiety in the formation of authentic selfhood. Even today, scholars continue to debate the precise nature of Kierkegaard's anxiety. Some argue that his emphasis on the dread of possibility anticipates contemporary cognitive behavioral theories of anxiety as an overestimation of threat. Others, like the contemporary theologian Rowan Williams, maintain that Kierkegaard's anxiety is fundamentally theological, a spiritual vertigo that arises when the finite self confronts the infinite. Williams writes, Kierkegaard invites us to see anxiety not as a malfunction of the mind, but as a sacred invitation to the divine. This theological reading aligns with Kierkegaard's own claim that anxiety is a sign of the presence of the divine, a point he makes explicit when he states, "Anxiety is the trembling of the soul before the infinite possibility of God." The richness of Kierkegaard's thought lies in its ability to accommodate these multiple interpretations without collapsing into contradiction. The same passage that a psychologist might read as a description of panic can, for a theologian, be a description of the soul's encounter with the divine mystery. The same line that a literary critic might see as a metaphor for artistic creation can, for a philosopher, be an ontological claim about the structure of freedom. This polyvalence is precisely what makes Kierkegaard's work a fertile ground for ongoing inquiry. Let us now consider how Kierkegaard's anxiety interacts with his broader ethical project. In either/or, the ethical stage is characterized by the commitment to universal principles, marriage, social responsibility, fidelity to one's promises. Yet the transition from the aesthetic to the ethical is not smooth. It is accompanied by a profound anxiety, a sense that the individual is leaving behind the safety of immediate pleasure for the weighty burden of duty. Kierkegaard describes this as the moment of decision, where the self must confront the possibility of regret. In anxiety, this moment is rendered as the point where the self recognizes its own capacity to sin, not because it has already sinned, but because it can choose not to. The anxiety, then, is the internal alarm that signals the ethical significance of a choice. The religious stage, which Kierkegaard reaches in Fear and Trembling, intensifies this dynamic. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is the ultimate example of a decision made in the face of overwhelming anxiety. Abraham does not simply act out of obedience. He experiences a terror that his own ethical duty, protecting his child, conflicts with the divine command. Yet he makes the leap of faith, transcending the ethical into the religious. In anxiety, Kierkegaard writes, when the self stands before the absolute, anxiety becomes the very ground upon which faith is built. Thus, the religious stage can be seen as a transformation of anxiety from a paralyzing dread into a generative force for authentic faith. It is also important to note that Kierkegaard's anxiety is not a static condition. He distinguishes between anxiety of freedom and anxiety of guilt. The former arises when the self becomes aware of the infinite possibilities before it. The latter emerges after a choice has been made, when the self reflects on the potential sin that might have been avoided. This distinction anticipates later existential thinkers who separate existential dread from moral remorse. It also reflects Kierkegaard's own personal oscillation between moments of intense self-examination and periods of outward resignation, as evidenced in his later years when he withdrew from public life and devoted himself to writing under pseudonyms. To bring the discussion full circle, we must return to the two historical anecdotes that first anchored our narrative. The breakup with Regine Olsen was not merely a romantic tragedy. It was a lived experiment in confronting the dizziness of freedom. Kierkegaard's decision to remain single allowed him to experience the anxiety of unchosen possibilities, a condition that would later become the theoretical cornerstone of his philosophy. The public feud over the moment was not simply a theological squabble. It was a manifestation of his belief that the institutional church had muted the authentic encounter with anxiety, replacing it with ritual and complacency. Both episodes illustrate how Kierkegaard's personal life and public engagement were inseparable from his philosophical project. In the final analysis, the concept of anxiety stands as a bridge between biography, theology, and philosophy. It is a text that draws from the intellectual currents of Hegelian idealism, romantic subjectivity, and pietist devotion, while simultaneously critiquing them. It weaves in the anti-rationalism of Hamann and the feeling-centered theology of Schleiermacher, creating a tapestry that is at once historically grounded and timelessly relevant. The work's central claim that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom continues to resonate, inviting each new generation to reconsider the role of dread in the human condition. As we reflect on Kierkegaard's life, his broken engagement, his clash with the church, and his relentless pursuit of authentic existence, we might ask ourselves, how often do we in our modern lives stand before the same abyss of possibility? How often do we feel the vertigo of freedom when faced with a career change, a relationship decision, or a moral dilemma? Perhaps the answer lies not in seeking to eliminate anxiety, but in learning to listen to it, to recognize it as the signpost Kierkegaard described, a sign that we are truly alive, that we are standing at the threshold of a moment that demands a choice, that we are, in the most profound sense, free. And so, as the calm voice of this narration draws to a close, let us carry with us Kierkegaard's invitation to sit with our anxiety, to feel its trembling, and to understand that within that trembling lies the possibility of becoming who we are meant to be. In the words of Kierkegaard himself, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. It is the condition of the human being as a possibility. May we, like the earnest seeker of the 19th-century Danish philosopher, learn to embrace that dizziness, and in doing so, discover the authentic self that waits beyond the abyss. It is a quiet evening in the mind, and we sit together, the soft hum of a distant lecture hall fading into the background, as we turn our attention to one of the most haunting ideas ever articulated in the history of philosophy. The notion that anxiety is not merely a symptom of fear, but the very dizziness of freedom that accompanies the human capacity to choose. Søren Kierkegaard, that solitary Danish thinker of the 19th century, gave this feeling a name, a shape, and a purpose. In what follows, we will unpack his central thesis, define the terms that spin around it, walk through vivid illustrations that bring the abstract into everyday life, and then listen to the voices that have challenged, refined, and sometimes even denied his insight. All the while we will hear echoes of Hegel's absolute freedom, the whisper of Heidegger's ontological angst, and the later cries of Sartre's bad faith. Let us begin, gently, with the core concepts themselves. When Kierkegaard writes in the concept of anxiety that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, he is not speaking metaphorically about a fleeting nervousness that disappears after a cup of tea. He is describing a structural condition of human existence. The word dizziness here is not the physical spinning one feels after a sudden turn. It is an existential vertigo, a feeling of being unmoored when the horizon of possibilities expands beyond the familiar ground. To feel dizzy is to lose one's sense of orientation. To feel anxiety, in Kierkegaard's sense, is to lose the sense that the self is already settled, that the future is already written. The self, for Kierkegaardian thought, is always in the process of becoming, and that becoming is powered by freedom. The capacity to say yes or no, to affirm or to deny, to create a path where none previously existed. Let us pause and consider the term possibility. In everyday language, a possibility is a what-if, a scenario that may or may not happen. In Kierkegaard's philosophy, possibility is the ontological field that surrounds the self. It is not merely a list of options, but the very ground of what it means to be a self. Possibility is what makes the self a subject rather than a mere object. The self, then, is not a static entity, but a dynamic relation. The relation between the finite, concrete individual and the infinite potential that lies beyond. When we confront this relation, we encounter anxiety, because we recognize that each choice we make does not merely select among pre-given alternatives. It also creates a new horizon of possibilities, and it does so at the cost of closing off others. The term self in Kierkegaard's usage is also layered. He distinguishes the ontological self, the deeper, essential structure of being, from the psychological self, the collection of habits, memories, and attitudes that we normally think of as our personality. The ontological self is the I that stands before the world, aware of its own freedom, and thereby aware of its own responsibility. It is the I that can say, I am a sinner, not because it has been condemned by an external authority, but because it recognizes that it has the freedom to choose a relation to the divine, to the ethical, to the aesthetic. In this sense, anxiety is a sign that the ontological self is awake, and then there is the term sin, which Kierkegaard places at the heart of anxiety. He does not mean sin as a legalistic transgression, but as a condition of existential misrelation, the failure to align one's freedom with the proper ground of being. Anxiety, then, is the trembling awareness that we could, at any moment, misalign ourselves, that we could turn away from the authentic possibility of becoming who we are called to be. It is the dizziness that warns us we are perched on the edge of a precipice, and that a single step in the wrong direction could lead to a fall into inauthenticity. To make these abstractions palpable, let us imagine a young student, Anna, standing at the crossroads of her university life. She has completed a degree in biology, but she feels an inexplicable pull toward literature. The career options before her stretch out like a vast plain: a research lab, a teaching position, a publishing house, perhaps even a nonprofit focused on environmental advocacy. Each path promises a different version of herself: scientist, educator, writer, activist. As she weighs these alternatives, a knot forms in her stomach. She knows that choosing one will inevitably close the doors on the others. This is not simple fear of failure. It is a deeper, unsettling awareness that the very act of choosing will shape the very core of who she will become. The dizziness is the sensation of standing at the edge of a boundless field, feeling the wind of infinite possibilities, while the ground beneath her seems to shift with each imagined step. In Kierkegaardian terms, Anna's anxiety is the concrete manifestation of the ontological self confronting its freedom. Now picture a different scenario. A mid-level manager, Thomas, discovers that his company is illegally dumping toxic waste into a river that supplies drinking water to a nearby town. The moral landscape is murky. Reporting the crime could protect thousands, but it would also jeopardize his career, his family's financial security, and perhaps even his own safety. Remaining silent preserves his comfort but makes him complicit in harm. As Thomas wrestles with this decision, a cold shiver runs through him. He is not merely afraid of being fired. He is aware that his freedom to act or not act carries the weight of a moral possibility that could define his very being. He feels the dizziness of the fact that, in this moment, he can become either a courageous whistleblower or a silent participant. The anxiety that grips him is not a simple fear of consequences, but the existential realization that his choice will carve a new shape for his self, aligning or misaligning it with the ethical ground he implicitly acknowledges. Kierkegaard makes a crucial distinction between what he calls psychological anxiety and existential anxiety. Psychological anxiety, he says, is the ordinary, everyday unease that arises from specific, identifiable threats, a looming exam, a health scare, a financial worry. It is anxiety that can be traced to a particular object and, in principle, can be alleviated by removing that object. Existential anxiety, by contrast, is not attached to any concrete circumstance. It is a background hum that persists even when the external world is calm. It is the anxiety of the possibility of possibility itself. In the concept of anxiety, he writes, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, that is, the vertigo of the mind when it is confronted with the possibility of possibility, the possibility that there is a possibility for the possibility of something else." This dense sentence, when spoken aloud, sounds almost like a tongue twister, but it captures the core of his claim. The mind is dizzy because it sees that each possibility carries within it the seed of further possibilities, an endless chain that cannot be fully mapped. The psychological anxiety of a test can be solved by studying. The existential anxiety of freedom cannot be solved by any amount of preparation because it is rooted in the very structure of being. Kierkegaard also emphasizes that existential anxiety is not a flaw to be eradicated, but a necessary condition for authentic existence. He writes, "Anxiety is the spirit's way of pointing out the possibility of sin, and therefore it is the spirit's way of pointing out the possibility of becoming." In other words, anxiety is a guidepost, a signal that the self is standing before a moral crossroads. It invites us to confront the abyss of our own freedom and to decide, consciously, which direction to take. Now, as we linger on this insight, we must also listen to the voices that have challenged it. The first major counterargument comes from Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. Freud understood anxiety as a symptom of repressed drives, a psychic alarm that warns the ego of an imminent threat from the unconscious. In Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety, he writes, "Anxiety is the result of the repression of the instinctual urges which, if allowed to surface, would cause a breakdown of the ego's defensive mechanisms." From Freud's perspective, anxiety is a signal that something forbidden lies beneath the surface, not a signal that we are confronting the infinite possibilities of freedom. The anxiety that Anna feels, for example, would be interpreted as a manifestation of her repressed desire to reject the expectations of her family, perhaps a latent wish to escape the social role assigned to her. Thomas's unease, in Freudian terms, would be read as a conflict between his superego's moral demands and his id's desire for safety and approval. The Freudian model thus reduces existential anxiety to a psychological phenomenon, one that can be treated through analysis, transference, and the uncovering of hidden wishes. Freud's view offers a powerful therapeutic tool, yet it also narrows the scope of anxiety. If anxiety is always tied to repressed drives, then the possibility that anxiety might arise even when no repressed content is present, when a person simply stands before a genuine, open-ended choice, appears to be left out. Kierkegaard would argue that such a reduction overlooks the ontological dimension of freedom itself, the very condition that makes the self capable of being both a subject and a sinner. A second, perhaps more philosophically resonant, counterpoint comes from Martin Heidegger, who, in Being and Time, reinterprets anxiety, angst, as the fundamental way in which Dasein, the human being, encounters its own being toward death. Heidegger writes, "Anxiety reveals the world as it is, stripped of all the everyday equipment that we normally take for granted. It discloses the nothingness that underlies the world." Heidegger's angst is not about freedom in the Kierkegaardian sense. It is about the finitude of existence, the inevitable confrontation with the nothing that lies beyond any possibility. For Heidegger, anxiety is ontological, but it is not tied to the freedom to choose among possibilities. Rather, it is the mood that makes us aware that we are thrown into a world without a predetermined essence. In this view, Thomas's moral dilemma would be less about the freedom to become a whistleblower or a silent participant, and more about his confrontation with the fact that his existence is finite, that his life can end abruptly, and that the choices he makes are ultimately grounded in the finitude of being. Heidegger's critique, then, reframes anxiety as an exposure of the emptiness that underlies all beings, rather than as a signal of ethical possibility. This stands in contrast to Kierkegaard's claim that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, and thus intrinsically linked to the capacity for ethical choice. The two philosophers agree that anxiety is a fundamental mood, but they diverge on what that mood points toward: freedom and sin, or finitude and nothingness. The tension between these perspectives enriches our understanding. It reminds us that anxiety can be simultaneously a psychic alarm, an ontological mood, and a moral beacon. It also encourages us to ask, can we hold these interpretations together, or must we choose one over the other? In the practice of philosophy, the answer often lies in the productive tension itself. Let us now turn to the historical moments that shaped Kierkegaard's formulation of this dizzying idea. The year 1848 was a watershed across Europe. Revolutions erupted in Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and the Italian states, each demanding political freedom, national unification, and social reform. In Denmark, the political climate was relatively calm, but the reverberations of the revolutionary spirit were felt in the cafes and literary salons of Copenhagen. Kierkegaard, who was then a young theologian and writer, observed the fervor with a mixture of fascination and alarm. He wrote in his journal that the storm of the people seemed to be a collective expression of freedom, yet also a manifestation of anxiety on a national scale. He feared that the crowd's desire for emancipation was being driven not by a thoughtful recognition of responsibility, but by a reckless dizziness that could plunge society into chaos. In a letter to his friend Michael Pedersen, he noted, "The people are seized by a kind of collective anxiety, a trembling before the infinite possibilities of a new order, and they rush forward without the temperance of reflection." This observation fed directly into his philosophical work. He saw that the public sphere could experience the same existential dizziness that an individual feels when confronting freedom. The 1848 revolutions, then, become a vivid historical illustration of how the ontological self, when faced with the sudden opening of possibilities, can either rise to authentic selfhood or tumble into destructive frenzy. Another crucial context for Kierkegaard's thinking was the flourishing of the Danish Golden Age, a period of cultural effervescence marked by literary salons, artistic gatherings, and intellectual exchange. Figures such as Hans Christian Andersen, N.F.S. Grundtvig, and the poet Adam Oehlenschläger convened regularly in the homes of patrons like the philosopher and publisher Johann Ludwig Heiberg. In these salons, ideas about individualism, romanticism, and the role of the artist in society were debated with vigor. Kierkegaard, though often a solitary figure, attended many of these gatherings and absorbed the prevailing currents. He was particularly struck by the romantic emphasis on the inner self and the notion that the individual could transcend the crowd through authentic expression. Yet he also sensed a danger. The romantic exaltation of feeling could become a kind of aesthetic escapism, a way of avoiding the hard work of ethical choice. He wrote in a notebook entry from 1846. The salons celebrate the self as a work of art, yet they forget that the self is also a moral being, accountable before the divine, and that the freedom to create also carries the weight of sin. These reflections, nurtured in the warm glow of candlelit discussions, sharpened his focus on the relationship between freedom, anxiety, and ethical responsibility. The salons provided the fertile soil in which his idea of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom could grow, rooted both in romantic individualism and in a deep Christian ethic. Having situated Kierkegaard historically, we can now trace the line of influence that leads from his insights to later existential thinkers. Hegel, whose system Kierkegaard famously critiqued, spoke of absolute freedom as the culmination of the dialectical process, where the spirit realizes itself through the unfolding of history. For Hegel, freedom is achieved when the individual's will aligns with the rational development of the world's spirit. Kierkegaard, however, turned this notion on its head. He argued that the absolute freedom Hegel celebrated is precisely the source of anxiety, the moment when the individual recognizes that the universal rationality does not guarantee personal authenticity. In other words, the Hegelian synthesis that resolves contradictions into a higher unity does not eliminate the existential dread that arises when the self confronts its own possibilities. Kierkegaard's anxiety, then, can be read as a critique of Hegelian optimism. It reminds us that the march toward absolute freedom can leave the individual feeling more unmoored, not less. Later, Jean-Paul Sartre would pick up the thread of freedom and anxiety, albeit in a secular, existentialist framework. Sartre famously declared that existence precedes essence, and that humans are condemned to be free. He introduced the concept of bad faith, mauvaise foi, the self-deception whereby individuals flee from the responsibility of freedom by assuming they are bound by fixed roles or external determinants. When Sartre describes the feeling of nausea at the sight of a café table, he is pointing to the same dizziness that Kierkegaard identified, though he frames it in terms of the absurdity of existence rather than the possibility of sin. Sartre writes in Being and Nothingness, man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. The overlap is striking. Both thinkers see freedom as an unavoidable condition that brings with it an unsettling awareness of possibilities. Yet Sartre removes the theological dimension. There is no sin, no divine ground, replacing it with a radical responsibility to oneself. In this sense, Kierkegaard's anxiety can be seen as a theological precursor to Sartre's existential angst, each locating the source of human dread in the same place, the freedom to shape one's own being. Returning to our two concrete examples, we can now see how these philosophical currents illuminate the lived experience of anxiety. For Anna, the student, the dizziness is a moment where the ontological self meets the realm of possibilities. She can choose a path that aligns with her authentic calling, or she can fall into what Sartre would call bad faith, telling herself that she must follow the expectations of her parents because that is what people do. If she succumbs to bad faith, the anxiety may temporarily subside, but at the cost of denying her freedom. If she embraces the anxiety, she may feel the acute pain of uncertainty, but she also opens the door to authentic self-creation. For Thomas, the whistleblower, the moral ambiguity is a crucible where the theological notion of sin meets the secular notion of responsibility. Kierkegaard would argue that Thomas's anxiety is a warning that he stands before the possibility of sin. By remaining silent, he would be complicit in a moral wrongdoing. Yet, as Heidegger might suggest, the anxiety also reveals the underlying nothingness that makes any choice possible. It strips away the everyday rationalizations and forces Thomas to confront the raw fact of his finitude. The decision he makes will define his self, either as a person who chose the ethical possibility or as one who allowed the dread of consequence to dictate inaction. Let us now consider a further illustration that bridges the personal and the societal. Imagine a journalist in a repressive regime, faced with the decision to publish a story that could expose government corruption but also endanger her family. The possibilities stretch outward like a dark ocean. Safety, exile, martyrdom. The anxiety she feels is not merely fear of retaliation. It is the vertigo of recognizing that her freedom to inform the public carries the weight of shaping collective consciousness. She is, in Kierkegaardian terms, standing on the precipice of an ethical act that could either affirm her authentic self or plunge her into the abyss of self-negation. The journalist's anxiety, then, becomes a microcosm of the larger social anxieties that arise when a community confronts the possibility of radical change, a reminder that the dizziness of freedom is not confined to individual dilemmas but reverberates through the fabric of history. We have now traced the conceptual lineage, examined vivid scenarios, and heard the critiques that surround Kierkegaard's claim. Yet there remains a final piece. How does this notion of anxiety function in the modern world, beyond the realm of philosophy textbooks? In contemporary psychology, the term existential anxiety has been reclaimed by therapists who recognize that many of their clients suffer not only from specific phobias, but from a deep sense of meaninglessness, of being untethered from a purposeful narrative. Existential humanistic therapists such as Rollo May and Irvin Yalom explicitly draw on Kierkegaard's insight that anxiety can be a catalyst for growth. Yalom, in his seminal work Existential Psychotherapy, writes, "Anxiety, when confronted, can become a doorway to authenticity, a chance to choose who we wish to become." In the realm of technology, consider the modern choice overload that digital platforms present us with. Endless streaming options, algorithmic recommendations, career-changing gig economy opportunities. The paradox of choice amplifies the very dizziness Kierkegaard described. When a user scrolls through a catalog of thousands of movies, the anxiety is not about the fear of a bad movie, but about the awareness that each selection defines a fragment of the self's taste, its identity, its leisure. The modern individual, constantly confronted with curated possibilities, experiences a new form of existential anxiety, a digital vertigo that mirrors Anna's career dilemma on a scale that touches billions. Even in the political sphere, the concept remains relevant. The rise of populist movements can be read as a collective response to the anxiety of freedom in a globalized world. When traditional structures appear to dissolve, people experience a dizzying sense that the old possibilities have vanished, leaving a void. Some turn toward authoritarian promises that claim to restore certainty, thereby attempting to sidestep the anxiety of freedom. Kierkegaard would caution that such avoidance merely suppresses the authentic engagement with possibility, replacing it with a false sense of security. Let us now revisit the two historical anecdotes, this time with a richer texture. During the 1848 revolutions, a young Kierkegaard attended a public debate in Copenhagen where a radical speaker proclaimed, "The people shall be free." The crowd erupted in applause, but Kierkegaard, seated at the back, noted in his diary that the enthusiasm seemed to be a fevered trembling, not a calm assurance. He later reflected that the crowd's fervor was a manifestation of collective anxiety, a shared dizziness before the opening of a new political horizon. This moment crystallized his belief that anxiety is not merely a personal feeling, but a communal phenomenon that can either propel societies toward authentic freedom or plunge them into chaos. The second anecdote comes from the literary salon of the poet Adam Oehlenschläger, where Kierkegaard once overheard a conversation about the role of the poet as a creator of worlds. One guest declared that the poet must free himself from all moral constraints to let imagination soar. Kierkegaard, sipping his tea, interjected that true imagination cannot be divorced from ethical responsibility. Otherwise, it becomes a flight from the very possibility that defines the self. He wrote later that this exchange sharpened his conviction that the dizziness of freedom is not a call to abandon moral ground, but a call to confront it directly. These episodes illustrate how Kierkegaard's philosophy emerged from the interplay of personal observation, cultural discourse, and historical turbulence. They also show how his insight continues to echo in contemporary debates about freedom, responsibility, and the role of anxiety as a moral compass. In closing, let us reflect on the central claim once more, with the patience of a philosopher who knows that true understanding requires repeated hearing. Anxiety, for Kierkegaard, is not a defect to be cured, nor a mere symptom of hidden desires. It is the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that arises when the ontological self stands before the boundless field of possibilities, aware that each choice is both a creation and a potential sin. It is the trembling that signals the presence of a moral horizon, the invitation to step beyond the safety of the familiar and to become, authentically, who we are called to be. As we finish this segment, consider the words Kierkegaard himself penned in The Sickness unto Death. The self is a relation which relates itself to itself in the power of relating, and thereby becomes a self-relation. It is the relation that is the ground of its own possibility, and in that ground lies the anxiety that makes the self aware of its own freedom. Let those words settle into the quiet of your own mind. Feel the subtle shift that comes when you recognize that the anxiety you experience, whether in a career decision, a moral dilemma, or the simple act of scrolling through endless choices, is not a sign of weakness, but a sign that you are truly alive, truly free, and truly responsible. In that awareness lies the potential for authenticity, for growth, for the kind of self-creation that Kierkegaard imagined as the highest expression of human existence. May this reflection accompany you as you navigate the dizzying possibilities that lie ahead, and may the anxiety that arises be a compass, pointing you toward the authentic self that waits, patient and hopeful, on the other side of each choice. When we turn our attention to the middle ground of Kierkegaardian life, the ethical stage, we encounter a tension that is both unsettling and profoundly illuminating. Anxiety, for Kierkegaard, is no longer the idle restlessness of the aesthetic lover of possibilities, but a weight that settles upon the shoulders of the individual who has taken the first decisive step toward responsibility. He writes, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, and in the ethical stage that dizziness becomes the tremor that precedes a concrete choice, a moral commitment that cannot be postponed. Imagine, for a moment, a young man standing before the altar, his heart beating not only with love for his beloved, but also with the awareness that marriage is a covenant that binds him to a set of duties, promises, and societal expectations. This is the marriage dilemma that Kierkegaard uses to illustrate the ethical stage, the moment when the aesthetic delight in the possibility of love must be transformed into the ethical resolve to honor a promise, to become a husband, to assume the weight of another's future. In that instant, anxiety rises, not as a mere fear of failure, but as the recognition that one is now the author of a new, irreversible narrative. The freedom to choose has become a freedom to bind oneself, and with that binding comes the dread of the unknown consequences of that very binding. Kierkegaardian anxiety, then, is not a simple emotional reaction. It is the existential echo of the possibility of sin, the awareness that one might betray the very commitment one has just undertaken. The ethical stage demands that we confront this anxiety, not by fleeing from it, but by embracing it as a sign that we have indeed stepped onto the path of responsibility. In this way, anxiety serves a dual function. It threatens to paralyze us, yet it also enables the emergence of authentic selfhood. The paradox is that the very feeling that could drive us into despair, the dread of having chosen a path that might lead to suffering, is also the catalyst that forces us to own our freedom. This is why Kierkegaard insists that anxiety is a necessary precondition for authentic ethical living. It is the internal alarm that warns us that we have entered a realm where our choices matter in a way that they never did in the aesthetic swirl of possibilities. Yet the ethical stage for Kierkegaard is not the final destination. The next leap, the religious stage, demands that we confront anxiety with an even deeper surrender. Here the paradox intensifies. Anxiety both threatens and enables authentic faith. To illustrate this, Kierkegaard turns to the biblical narrative of Abraham, a story that he famously expounded upon in Fear and Trembling. Abraham is called to sacrifice his son Isaac, the very embodiment of his promised future, his lineage, his love. In that moment, Abraham's anxiety is not merely the fear of killing his child. It is the terror of confronting the absolute demand of God, a demand that seems to overturn all ethical norms. The ethical stage would demand that Abraham protect his son, that he honor the covenant of parenthood. The religious stage, however, summons a higher obedience that transcends the ethical. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is the religious resolution of anxiety. He does not deny his anxiety, but he allows it to be transformed by a leap of faith that accepts the absurd, that trusts in the incomprehensible purpose of the divine. Kierkegaard writes, "Faith is the paradox of the absurd," and in Abraham's story we see that paradox embodied. The anxiety that threatens to shatter Abraham's world, the possible loss of his beloved son, becomes the very ground upon which his faith is built. By embracing the absurd, Abraham does not eliminate anxiety. Rather, he reinterprets it as a sign that he is standing before the infinite, that his finite self is being stretched into the realm of the divine. In this way, the religious stage does not silence anxiety, but it reorients it. The anxiety that once threatened to drown the ethical self now becomes a conduit through which the individual can encounter the transcendent, the absolute paradox that Kierkegaardian scholars have long debated. The paradoxical nature of anxiety in Kierkegaard's three-stage model invites us to ask, can anxiety ever be fully resolved, or is it an ever-present companion that pushes us forward? The answer, according to Kierkegaard, is that anxiety is never fully eradicated. It is a perpetual reminder of our freedom and our finitude. In the ethical stage, it pushes us toward responsibility. In the religious stage, it pushes us toward the paradox of faith. This dynamic movement of anxiety from threat to enablement is what gives Kierkegaard's thought its vitality, and it is why his philosophy continues to resonate with those who grapple with the meaning of choice, commitment, and belief. But not everyone has accepted Kierkegaard's romantic rendering of suffering as the crucible of authenticity. One line of criticism argues that Kierkegaard romanticizes suffering, that he elevates anxiety to a quasi-spiritual virtue while neglecting the very real harm that chronic dread can inflict on the human psyche. Critics such as Karl Jaspers, though sympathetic to existential concerns, have warned that Kierkegaard's emphasis on the leap may encourage a dangerous glorification of self-inflicted torment. If anxiety is always a stepping stone toward higher authenticity, does that not risk justifying the endurance of unnecessary pain? The objection is that Kierkegaard's narrative could be read as encouraging individuals to cling to their anxieties, to wear them as badges of honor, rather than seeking relief or healing. This line of critique points to the danger of turning existential anxiety into a moral credential, a sign that one is truly authentic. In contemporary mental health discourse, this critique finds resonance. We now understand that chronic anxiety can be debilitating, that it can impair decision-making, and that it may require therapeutic intervention rather than existential glorification. A second counterargument comes from modern theologians who contend that Kierkegaard's solution, the leap of faith that resolves religious anxiety, undermines rational ethics. Thinkers such as Reinhold Niebuhr and, more recently, John D. Caputo have argued that Kierkegaard's insistence on a personal, subjective leap bypasses the communal and rational foundations of moral life. If Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac is presented as the ultimate act of faith, what does that say about the role of universal ethical standards? Critics ask whether the religious stage, by allowing the individual to suspend ethical norms in the name of divine command, opens the door to moral relativism or even fanaticism. They worry that Kierkegaard's portrayal of Abraham's obedience may be read as an endorsement of the higher law argument, where individual conscience can override established moral law. In this view, Kierkegaard's resolution of anxiety through faith could be seen as a retreat from the hard work of rational ethical deliberation, leaving the individual adrift in a sea of subjective belief without the moorings of shared moral reasoning. These criticisms do not, however, diminish the richness of Kierkegaard's insight into anxiety, but they do invite us to reconsider the balance between existential authenticity and the practical demands of ethical life. To understand the historical context that shaped Kierkegaard's thinking, we must recall his sharp critique of the Danish state church in the 1840s. Kierkegaard observed that the church had become complacent, more concerned with institutional stability than with the spiritual awakening of its members. He famously wrote, "The church is a graveyard of the living," suggesting that the institutionalized faith had turned into a safe, anxiety-free zone where true existential engagement was discouraged. This critique was not merely theological. It was a cultural indictment of a society that preferred the comforting lull of ritual over the unsettling call to individual responsibility. By exposing the church's complacency, Kierkegaard was, in a sense, warning that the religious stage could be reduced to a hollow form of religiosity if it failed to confront anxiety head-on. The controversy surrounding the 1843 publication of the concept of anxiety further illustrates the turbulence that surrounded Kierkegaard's ideas. When the work first appeared, it sparked heated debate among theologians and philosophers alike. Some accused Kierkegaard of promoting a psychological reading of sin that undermined traditional doctrines of original sin and divine grace. Others, especially within the Hegelian circles of Copenhagen, argued that Kierkegaard's emphasis on individual dread was a reactionary move against the rationalist optimism of the age. The book's reception was marked by polemics in newspapers, with critics labeling Kierkegaard a pessimist who threatened the moral fabric of society. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of this uproar, the concept of anxiety became a cornerstone for later existential thinkers, cementing the idea that anxiety is an ontological condition rather than merely a psychological symptom. Later in his career, Kierkegaardian thought would evolve into a more explicitly Christian articulation, most notably in Practice in Christianity. In that work, Kierkegaard returns to the theme of anxiety, but now frames it within the lived practice of discipleship. He writes, "The anxiety of the believer is the anxiety of the one who knows that the world is a battlefield and that the soul must be constantly defended against the seductions of comfort." Here, anxiety is no longer an abstract philosophical concept. It becomes a call to continual vigilance, a reminder that the religious stage demands ongoing engagement, not a one-time leap. This shift demonstrates that Kierkegaard saw the resolution of anxiety not as a final destination, but as an ongoing practice that requires both ethical responsibility and religious devotion. In contemporary times, the resonance of Kierkegaard's insights can be observed in the field of existential therapy, a branch of psychotherapy that draws heavily on the existential tradition. Therapists such as Irvin Yalom and Rollo may have incorporated the idea that anxiety can serve as a catalyst for growth, encouraging clients to confront the givens of existence, death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. In this therapeutic context, anxiety is not merely a symptom to be eliminated, but a signal that something in the client's life demands attention, a doorway to authentic self-exploration. For example, a client grappling with the marriage dilemma might be guided to view their anxiety not as a failure of love, but as a prompt to examine the deeper commitments they are willing to make. The therapist may ask, "What does this anxiety tell you about the values you hold most dear?" In this way, the therapeutic process mirrors Kierkegaard's ethical stage. The individual must acknowledge the weight of their freedom, accept the responsibility that comes with it, and move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. Similarly, existential therapy can draw on Abraham's story as a metaphor for the religious stage. When a client faces a crisis of faith, the therapist might invite them to explore the paradox of trusting in something beyond rational comprehension. The therapist could ask, "What does it mean for you to surrender, even when the stakes feel unbearably high?" By framing the client's anxiety as an invitation to a deeper, perhaps paradoxical form of commitment, the therapist follows Kierkegaard's lead. Anxiety is both a threat and an enabler. The therapeutic space becomes a safe arena where the client can experiment with the leap, not as a reckless abandonment of reason, but as a conscious, reflective act that acknowledges the limits of rationality while still honoring the human longing for transcendence. Returning to the marriage dilemma, we can see how the ethical stage's anxiety is intimately linked to the notion of the self before God. In Kierkegaardian language, the self is a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. When the individual decides to marry, they are not merely joining two lives, they are affirming a self that can stand in relation to the infinite, that is, to God, through a concrete temporal commitment. The anxiety that arises here is the awareness that this finite act carries infinite significance. It is the same anxiety that, in the religious stage, propels Abraham to confront the divine command. Thus, the two examples are not isolated. They are stages on a continuum where anxiety, once recognized, can be transformed from a paralyzing dread into a motivating force toward authenticity. Kierkegaard's own life provides a poignant anecdote that underscores the personal stakes of this philosophical project. His broken engagement to Regine Olsen in 1841 was not a mere romantic tragedy. It was a deliberate act of self-sacrifice aimed at preserving his capacity for authentic philosophical work. Kierkegaard felt that the emotional entanglement of marriage would compromise his ability to confront existential anxiety in its purest form. He wrote to Regine, "I love you, but I love my work more," a statement that reflects the ethical tension between personal desire and the higher calling he perceived. This personal decision mirrors the ethical stage's demand for responsibility, and his subsequent turn toward religious writing can be seen as his own leap of faith, an attempt to resolve the anxiety generated by his sacrifice through a deeper commitment to Christian existentialism. The interplay between anxiety, ethics, and religion in Kierkegaard's thought also invites us to consider the broader philosophical conversation. When we cross-reference his ideas with those of Friedrich Nietzsche, we encounter a stark contrast. Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead and his embrace of the will to power suggests that anxiety, for him, should be overcome by the affirmation of life and the creation of new values. Kierkegaard, by contrast, insists that anxiety is inseparable from the divine, that the religious leap is the only authentic way to move beyond the despair of the ethical stage. Yet both philosophers agree that anxiety signals a crisis point, a moment where the individual must choose, either to create new meanings in the secular realm or to surrender to a transcendent purpose. This dialogue enriches our understanding of anxiety as a universal human experience that can be interpreted in divergent, yet equally profound, ways. Another cross-reference can be made to the phenomenological work of Martin Heidegger, especially his notion of angst as the mood that reveals the nothingness of existence. Heidegger's angst, like Kierkegaard's anxiety, is not a pathological condition, but an ontological disclosure that forces Dasein to confront its own being toward death. While Heidegger emphasizes the ontological structure of anxiety, Kierkegaard foregrounds the ethical and religious dimensions, showing how that existential disclosure can lead to concrete moral action or a leap of faith. Both thinkers, however, agree that anxiety is a doorway rather than a dead end, and this convergence underscores the lasting influence of Kierkegaard's early insights on later existential and phenomenological traditions. The paradox of anxiety as both threat and enablement finds a striking illustration in the modern phenomenon of existential risk. In an age where climate change, nuclear proliferation, and artificial intelligence pose unprecedented threats, many individuals experience a profound sense of dread about the future. This collective anxiety can either paralyze societies into inaction or, as Kierkegaard would suggest, motivate a collective ethical responsibility. If we interpret this anxiety as a call to the ethical stage, we might see it prompting political engagement, policy reforms, and a renewed sense of stewardship for the planet. If we interpret it through the religious stage, perhaps it inspires a spiritual reawakening, a recognition that humanity's survival may depend on a deeper, perhaps transcendent, alignment with values that surpass immediate self-interest. In both cases, anxiety becomes a catalyst for transformation, echoing Kierkegaard's claim that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, and that this dizziness can be harnessed for authentic action. To bring these ideas back to the concrete, let us imagine a person today who is faced with the decision to leave a secure career in order to pursue a vocation that aligns more closely with their moral convictions, perhaps becoming a social worker, a teacher, or an activist. The anxiety that surfaces is not merely fear of financial instability. It is the recognition that they are about to redefine their identity, to step into an ethical commitment that will shape their very being. In the Kierkegaardian frame, this person is standing at the threshold of the ethical stage, feeling the weight of responsibility, the dizziness that accompanies the freedom to choose. If they heed the anxiety, they might find themselves moving toward an authentic self, one that is no longer adrift in aesthetic possibilities, but rooted in a concrete ethical purpose. Now imagine that same individual, after years of ethical commitment, encounters a profound spiritual crisis, perhaps a loss of faith, a deep questioning of the meaning behind their work. Here, the religious stage beckons and the anxiety resurfaces, this time as a sense of existential emptiness that cannot be resolved by ethical action alone. The individual may experience a leap of faith, not necessarily in the Christian sense, but as a willingness to embrace a larger narrative that transcends personal achievement. They might turn to meditation, to contemplative practices, or to a renewed relationship with a religious tradition that offers a sense of purpose beyond the ethical. In this moment, the paradox is fully realized. Anxiety threatens to dissolve their sense of self, yet it also opens the possibility for a deeper, more expansive faith that redefines their relationship to the world. Kierkegaard's own later work, Practice in Christianity, would argue that this ongoing interplay between anxiety, ethics, and faith is not a one-time event, but a perpetual practice. He urges the believer to continually stand before the abyss of anxiety, to see it as a reminder that the divine call is ever present, demanding renewed commitment. This perspective aligns with contemporary existential therapy's emphasis on ongoing authenticity, where clients are encouraged to return repeatedly to the sources of their anxiety, to reinterpret them, and to use them as springboards for growth. The therapist, like Kierkegaard, does not aim to eliminate anxiety, but to help the client see it as a signpost pointing toward deeper self-knowledge. In reflecting on the two counterarguments we introduced earlier, it becomes clear that the tension between romanticizing suffering and undermining rational ethics is itself a form of anxiety. Critics who warn against glorifying anxiety are, in a sense, expressing their own fear that the human condition might be reduced to perpetual dread without hope. Modern theologians who caution against the leap of faith are anxious about the erosion of communal moral standards. Both sets of critics, therefore, are engaging with the same existential dilemma that Kierkegaard identifies: how to balance the individual's authentic encounter with anxiety against the need for collective ethical coherence. Their concerns invite us to refine Kierkegaardian thought, perhaps by integrating a more nuanced view that recognizes the therapeutic benefits of anxiety while also acknowledging the necessity of rational ethical frameworks. One way to bridge this gap is to consider Kierkegaard's notion of subjectivity as truth. He does not deny the importance of rational discourse. Rather, he insists that truth is ultimately lived, experienced, and embodied. The ethical stage provides the rational scaffolding, the universal principles, the duties, the social contracts, while the religious stage adds the subjective, passionate commitment that transcends pure reason. In this synthesis, anxiety becomes the hinge that allows the individual to move from the abstract to the concrete, from the universal to the particular. The ethical stage offers a map, but the religious stage provides the compass that points toward a deeper, perhaps unknowable, destination. Historically, the 1843 controversy over the concept of anxiety serves as a reminder that such philosophical provocations do not occur in a vacuum. When Kierkegaard published his treatise, he was confronting not only the Hegelian optimism of his day, but also the complacent religiosity of the Danish state church. His assertion that anxiety is a dizziness of freedom challenged the prevailing notion that faith should be a calm, unquestioned assent. The public debate that ensued, with pamphlets, newspaper essays, and heated sermons, demonstrated how deeply the idea of anxiety struck at the cultural heart of Danish society. Some accused Kierkegaard of undermining social order, others praised his courage in exposing the spiritual lethargy of the time. This historical episode underscores that anxiety, when brought to the fore, can be both a destabilizing force and a catalyst for cultural renewal. The anecdote of Kierkegaard's critique of the state church further illustrates how he saw institutional religion as a potential barrier to authentic faith. He argued that the church, by providing a comfortable routine of liturgy and doctrine, allowed believers to avoid the unsettling confrontation with anxiety that true faith demands. In his pamphlet The Moment, he wrote, "The church is the graveyard of the living, where the spirit lies down to rest, never again to awaken." For Kierkegaard, the religious stage required a personal encounter with the divine that could not be mediated by institutional safety nets. This critique resonates today in discussions about the role of organized religion in an age of spiritual pluralism. Does the comfort of community dilute the necessary anxiety that spurs authentic belief, or does it provide a supportive framework that helps individuals navigate that anxiety without being overwhelmed? Kierkegaard's philosophical project, therefore, can be seen as an invitation to live with anxiety as a companion rather than an adversary. He does not propose a method to eradicate it. Instead, he offers a roadmap for transformation. The ethical stage asks us to own our freedom, to accept the weight of our promises, and to let anxiety reveal the depth of our responsibility. The religious stage then asks us to surrender the rational certainty that the ethical stage provides, to trust in the paradox of faith, and to allow anxiety to become the crucible in which authentic belief is forged. In doing so, Kierkegaard provides a framework that remains relevant for contemporary seekers, therapists, and ethicists alike. Consider, for a moment, the modern practice of mindfulness meditation, which has been incorporated into many therapeutic settings. Mindfulness encourages individuals to sit with anxiety, to observe it without judgment, and to recognize it as a transient mental state rather than a fixed identity. This practice mirrors Kierkegaard's call to confront anxiety directly, to see it as a sign of freedom rather than a defect to be corrected. When a practitioner feels the dizziness of freedom, they can, through mindful awareness, notice the feeling, label it, and then choose how to respond, whether to reaffirm an ethical commitment, to explore a deeper spiritual question, or simply to sit with the uncertainty. In this way, mindfulness can be viewed as a practical embodiment of Kierkegaard's philosophical insight, translating the abstract notion of anxiety into a lived, experiential technique. Another contemporary illustration can be found in the realm of artistic creation. Many artists describe a profound anxiety that precedes the act of creation, the fear that their work will be inadequate, that it will not capture the truth they seek. Yet this very anxiety often fuels their most authentic pieces, pushing them beyond mere aesthetic pleasure into a realm of genuine expression. In Kierkegaardian terms, the artist's anxiety is the ethical impulse to commit to a vision, while the subsequent creative breakthrough can be seen as a religious moment, where the artist surrenders to a flow that transcends personal calculation. The resulting artwork becomes a testament to the paradox that anxiety both threatens and enables authenticity. To bring these threads together, let us return to the central question of this segment. How does Kierkegaard situate anxiety within his three-stage model, and what does this tell us about the human journey from despair to the leap of faith? The answer lies in recognizing that anxiety is the thread that weaves together the aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages. In the aesthetic, anxiety is the vague unease that hints at the emptiness of endless possibilities. In the ethical, it becomes a concrete recognition of responsibility, a trembling before the altar of commitment, illustrated by the marriage dilemma. In the religious, it reaches its apex in the paradox of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, where anxiety is transformed into a profound trust that embraces the absurd. Each stage does not erase the anxiety of the previous one. Rather, it deepens its meaning, reframes its purpose, and guides the individual toward a higher mode of existence. The paradox that anxiety both threatens and enables authentic faith is thus not a contradiction, but a dynamic tension that propels the self forward. The threat lies in the possibility of despair, of being immobilized by the sheer weight of freedom. The enablement lies in the opportunity to choose, to act, to trust, and to become. Kierkegaard's insight is that without anxiety, there would be no impetus to move beyond the safety of the aesthetic, no call to ethical responsibility, and no invitation to the religious leap. Anxiety is the catalyst that forces the self to confront its own finitude and to reach beyond it. In concluding this exploration, we might ask ourselves, how can we, in our own lives, honor the role of anxiety without succumbing to its paralyzing aspects? Perhaps the answer lies in a balanced practice that acknowledges the ethical obligations of our choices, as the marriage dilemma reminds us, while also remaining open to the possibility of a transcendent trust, as Abraham's story invites. By doing so, we echo Kierkegaard's call to live deliberately, to stand before the abyss of anxiety, and to make the leap, not blindly, but with the full awareness that the leap itself is an act of freedom, an affirmation that we are, after all, capable of moving from despair to authentic faith. The question that has haunted philosophers for centuries is not merely what we are, but what we might become when we stand at the edge of our own possibility. In the quiet moments before a decision, when the future stretches out like an uncharted sea, we feel a particular kind of tension, a trembling that is not fear of something concrete, but a more diffuse, unsettling awareness of the very freedom that makes us who we are. It is this tension that Søren Kierkegaard called anxiety, that Martin Heidegger called being toward death, that Jean-Paul Sartre called existential angst, and that contemporary existential humanistic psychologists such as Rollo May and Viktor Frankl have tried to transform into a source of meaning. In the following meditation, we will walk together through these four landscapes, compare their contours, and see how they intersect in the lived experience of two very different people, a veteran confronting mortality and a teenager wrestling with identity. We will also hear the voice of a therapist who turns anxiety into a compass for meaning, and we will pause to consider the criticisms that challenge the universal reach of these ideas. All the while, we will hear echoes of phenomenology, of existential psychotherapy, and even of the modern neuroscience that distinguishes fear from anxiety. Let us begin. Kierkegaard first introduced the term angst, or anxiety, in his 1844 work The Concept of Anxiety. He wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." In his own words, anxiety is not a reaction to a specific danger, but the very feeling that arises when the self stands before the possibility of choosing itself. The self, for Kierkegaard, is a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, the temporal and the eternal. When we become aware that we can choose beyond the limits of our present circumstance, the ground beneath us seems to wobble. This wobble is not a symptom of pathology, it is the price of authentic existence. He went further, describing anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, a necessary prelude to the leap of faith that defines the religious individual. In this sense, anxiety is a moral and spiritual alarm, a signal that the self is confronting its own freedom and the responsibility that accompanies it. Heidegger, a generation later, took a different path. In his 1927 lecture, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, he spoke of anxiety, angst, as the primordial mood that reveals the nothing. He said, "Anxiety is the being of Dasein that reveals the nothing and the finitude of existence." For Heidegger, anxiety is not about moral choice, but about the ontological condition of Dasein, the human being who is always already thrown into the world. When anxiety strikes, the everyday world of equipment and projects recedes, and we become aware of our own being toward death. The world no longer appears as a collection of useful tools. Instead, we see ourselves as finite beings whose existence is bounded by the possibility of non-existence. In this moment, the they-self, the anonymous crowd that usually determines our choices, falls away, and we are left with the bare fact of our own being. Heidegger's anxiety is thus a clearing, a space in which the truth of our finitude can be disclosed. Sartre, writing in the aftermath of World War II, articulated a third perspective. In his 1943 essay Existentialism is a Humanism, he famously declared, "Man is condemned to be free." For Sartre, freedom is an inescapable condition, and with it comes a profound angst that arises from the realization that there is no pre-existing essence to guide us. He wrote, "Existential anguish is the feeling that we are wholly responsible for what we are." Unlike Kierkegaard, Sartre does not locate this anguish within a religious framework, nor does he see it as a doorway to a transcendent truth. Instead, it is the weight of radical responsibility that makes us feel the absurdity of our condition. The world offers no external moral law. We must create values in the face of an indifferent universe. Sartre's angst, then, is a political and ethical crisis, a call to authenticity that demands that we act in good faith despite the lack of any guarantee of meaning. The modern existential humanistic psychologists, Rollo May, Viktor Frankl, and others, have taken these philosophical insights and tried to bring them into the therapeutic arena. May, in his 1950 book The Meaning of Anxiety, echoed Kierkegaard's description of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, but he reframed it as a therapeutic resource. He argued that anxiety signals a disruption in the creative process of self-formation, and that by confronting it, the individual can discover a deeper sense of purpose. Frankl, in his seminal work Man's Search for Meaning, described a different but related phenomenon, the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness that arises when life is stripped of meaning. He proposed that confronting this vacuum, often experienced as anxiety, can become a catalyst for finding meaning through love, work, or suffering. Both May and Frankl thus treat anxiety not as a pathological symptom to be eliminated, but as a doorway to meaning-making, a view that aligns with the existential philosophers while also offering concrete clinical techniques. To make these abstract ideas palpable, let us consider two concrete case studies. In the first, a veteran named Thomas returns home after a decade of service in a conflict zone. He has survived multiple deployments, witnessed death, and carried the weight of responsibility for his comrades. Now, sitting in a quiet kitchen, Thomas feels a heaviness that is not fear of an external enemy, but an unsettling awareness that his life, once defined by the rhythm of missions, is now open. He describes the feeling as a deep, hollow dread that surfaces when he thinks about the future. From a Heideggerian perspective, Thomas is experiencing being toward death. The war has stripped away the everyday distractions that once concealed his finitude. In the silence of civilian life, the possibility of his own non-existence becomes unmistakably present. He no longer can hide behind the they-self of the military hierarchy. The world now asks him to confront his own mortality without the buffer of uniform and orders. Heidegger would say that Thomas's anxiety reveals the nothing, that it is the moment when his being toward death becomes explicit. The veteran's sense that time is slipping away is not a fear of a specific threat, but an ontological recognition that his existence is bounded. In therapy, a Heidegger-informed practitioner might encourage Thomas to sit with this anxiety, to see it as a clearing that allows him to reorient his projects toward authentic possibilities, perhaps returning to a vocation he abandoned, or engaging in community work that honors the lives he lost. Contrast this with the second case study, in which a 16-year-old named Maya grapples with her identity. She lives in a suburban town, spends hours scrolling through social media, and feels an ever-present pressure to fit into multiple, often contradictory categories: student, friend, activist, daughter. Maya tells her counselor that she feels stuck in a loop of what-ifs, that each decision about her future seems to open a new set of possibilities that she cannot fully grasp. For Kierkegaard, Maya's experience is the classic anxiety of the dizziness of freedom. She is confronted with the infinite possibilities of who she could become, and the weight of that freedom makes her heart race. Her anxiety is not about an external danger, but about the moral responsibility of choosing a self that is authentic. Kierkegaard would argue that Maya's anxiety is a necessary precondition for a leap of faith, a decisive movement toward a self-definition that is not merely a product of social expectations. In a therapeutic setting informed by existential humanistic principles, a therapist might invite Maya to explore the values that truly matter to her, to distinguish between the they-self and the I-self. By acknowledging that anxiety signals the presence of freedom, Maya can begin to see her dread not as a barrier, but as an invitation to choose. She might decide to commit to a cause that resonates deeply, thereby transforming her anxiety into a purposeful direction. Now let us turn to the third case study, which brings the work of Rollo May into focus. Dr. Elena Rivera is a clinical psychologist who works in an urban community health center. She encounters a client, Carlos, a middle-aged man who has been diagnosed with chronic heart disease. Carlos reports a persistent sense of unease, describing it as a knot in my chest that never goes away, even when I'm not thinking about my illness. Dr. Rivera recognizes this as anxiety that is not merely a physiological response to health concerns, but an existential alarm about the meaning of his remaining life. Drawing on May's concept of meaning-making, she invites Carlos to articulate what matters most to him beyond his medical condition. Through a series of reflective dialogues, Carlos discovers that he has long suppressed a desire to write poetry, a desire he dismissed as impractical. By reframing his anxiety as a signal that his current life narrative is incomplete, Dr. Rivera helps him to construct a new project that gives his remaining days a sense of purpose. In this way, anxiety is transformed from a debilitating symptom into a catalyst for creative self-actualization, exactly as May envisioned. These three narratives illustrate how the same phenomenological experience, an unsettling awareness of freedom, finitude, or meaninglessness, can be interpreted through different philosophical lenses and applied in therapeutic practice. Yet the richness of these perspectives also invites criticism. Let us examine two prominent counterarguments. The first objection is that Kierkegaard's explicitly religious framing limits the universal applicability of his concept of anxiety. Critics argue that by tying anxiety to a leap of faith and the Christian notion of sin, Kierkegaard narrows his theory to a theologically inclined audience, making it less relevant for secular individuals or those of other faith traditions. They point out that his insistence on the dizziness of freedom, as a prelude to a religious commitment, may alienate those who do not share his metaphysical commitments. In response, contemporary scholars have highlighted that Kierkegaard's focus on the subjective experience of anxiety, its phenomenology, transcends doctrinal boundaries. Even if the ultimate resolution he proposes is religious, the descriptive part of his analysis, anxiety as the awareness of freedom, remains valuable for secular existentialists and therapists alike. Moreover, existential humanistic psychologists have deliberately secularized Kierkegaard's insights, extracting the therapeutic potential of anxiety without requiring a leap to the divine. The second objection targets Heidegger's ontological analysis, claiming that it renders Kierkegaard's moral dimension obsolete. Heidegger's emphasis on being and the clearing of the world allegedly reduces ethical considerations to mere existential facts. By focusing on the disclosure of the nothing, Heidegger appears to sideline the moral urgency that Kierkegaard places at the heart of anxiety, the need to choose responsibly before God. Critics argue that if anxiety is simply the unveiling of finitude, then the call to act morally becomes an afterthought, a cultural overlay rather than an essential component of the experience. Heideggerians counter that morality is not eliminated but resituated within the authentic projection of one's own being toward death. When the they-self falls away, the individual is free to project their own possibilities, which inevitably includes ethical decisions. In this view, moral responsibility is not a separate layer but an integral part of authentic existence, albeit expressed without recourse to a divine law. The debate continues, and it is precisely this tension that makes the comparative study of anxiety so fertile. To deepen our appreciation of these philosophical dialogues, let us revisit two historical anecdotes that illuminate the intellectual cross-pollination among these thinkers. In the spring of 1927, at the University of Freiburg, Martin Heidegger delivered a lecture entitled The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. In the opening minutes, he quoted Kierkegaard verbatim. "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Heidegger paused, letting the words linger before he continued, "But the anxiety that I speak of is not the anxiety of the moral individual. It is the anxiety that reveals the nothing." This moment is significant because it shows Heidegger's acknowledgement of Kierkegaard's phenomenological insight while simultaneously redirecting it toward his own ontological project. The lecture was later published in Being and Time as a footnote, but the original transcript reveals Heidegger's deliberate engagement with Kierkegaard's language, a gesture that underscores the continuity and rupture between the two. A second anecdote comes from the intellectual climate of occupied France in 1943. Jean-Paul Sartre, freshly liberated from the constraints of the Vichy regime, delivered a public lecture titled Existentialism is a Humanism. In his address, he directly responded to the Kierkegaardian theme of anxiety, stating, "If anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, then it is also the condition of our humanity, for we are condemned to be free." Sartre's remark was both an affirmation and a critique. He accepted the phenomenological core of anxiety, but rejected the religious resolution that Kierkegaard offered. He argued that freedom is not a gift from a transcendent source, but a burden imposed by the very nature of existence. This public debate helped to crystallize existentialism as a secular movement, and it illustrates how Sartre positioned himself in dialogue with Kierkegaard's legacy. These anecdotes remind us that philosophical ideas do not arise in isolation. They echo across generations, each thinker hearing the previous voice and answering it in a new key. The conversation continues today, not only in philosophy departments but also in the halls of psychotherapy and the laboratories of neuroscience. Indeed, modern neuroscience has begun to differentiate between fear and anxiety in ways that resonate with these philosophical distinctions. Fear is typically linked to an immediate, identifiable threat and activates the amygdala's rapid response circuitry. Anxiety, by contrast, involves the ventral prefrontal cortex and the insular cortex, regions associated with anticipation, uncertainty, and the appraisal of potential future threats. Researchers have found that when individuals contemplate abstract possibilities, such as career choices, existential concerns, or mortality, the brain engages networks that mirror the phenomenological experience of anxiety described by Kierkegaard and Heidegger. This neurobiological evidence suggests that the dizziness of freedom is not merely a poetic metaphor, but a measurable state of heightened neural activity in regions that process uncertainty and self-referential thought. Phenomenology, the methodological backbone of both Kierkegaard's and Heidegger's analyses, provides the bridge between lived experience and scientific observation. By bracketing assumptions and focusing on the intentional structure of consciousness, phenomenologists have offered a descriptive map that neuroscience can now test. Existential psychotherapy, founded on this phenomenological tradition, uses the therapist's attuned presence to help clients articulate the qualitative texture of their anxiety, the way it feels in the body, the way it colors perception, the way it opens up or closes down possibilities. In practice, this often means encouraging a client to sit with the nothingness that Heidegger describes, or to confront the moral urgency that Kierkegaard emphasizes, or to recognize the radical responsibility that Sartre insists upon. Each approach offers a different entry point, but all share the conviction that anxiety is a doorway, not a dead end. Let us now return to our case studies and imagine how a therapist might weave together these philosophical strands in a single session. Imagine Dr. Rivera aware of Kierkegaard's moral framing, Heidegger's ontological clearing, Sartre's radical freedom, and May's meaning-making, meeting with Carlos, the man with heart disease. She might begin by validating the physiological reality of his anxiety, acknowledging the heart's response, the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, while simultaneously inviting him to explore the existential dimension. She could ask, when you feel that knot, what thoughts accompany it? Do you sense a fear of something specific, or is it more a sense that your life story is unfinished? If Carlos speaks of a lingering question about whether he has lived a life worth living, Dr. Rivera might draw on Kierkegaard. Your anxiety may be the dizziness of the freedom you have to shape your remaining days. She could then introduce Heidegger's clearing. In this moment of anxiety, the everyday distractions fall away, revealing the space where you can decide what matters most. Finally, she could invoke Sartre's responsibility. Because you are free, you bear the responsibility for the meaning you create now. By integrating these perspectives, the therapist helps Carlos reframe his anxiety as an invitation to author his own narrative, aligning with May's therapeutic goal of meaning-making. The practical implications of these philosophical insights extend beyond individual therapy. In education, for instance, teachers who recognize the anxiety inherent in adolescence can design curricula that encourage authentic self-exploration rather than rote conformity. By presenting choices as opportunities for self-definition, educators can harness the Kierkegaardian dizziness of freedom as a motivational force. In organizational leadership, managers who understand Heidegger's being toward death can create cultures that acknowledge the finitude of projects and careers, thereby encouraging employees to pursue work that aligns with deeper values rather than merely fulfilling external expectations. Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom can inform social policies that empower individuals to take ownership of their lives, while also recognizing the systemic constraints that shape possibilities, a balance that existential humanistic psychology strives to achieve. Returning to the counterarguments, let us examine them once more in light of these applications. The claim that Kierkegaard's religious framing limits his relevance can be addressed by observing how secular therapists have already appropriated his concept of anxiety without invoking God. The core phenomenology and awareness of freedom and responsibility remains intact. Even in faith-based counseling, the religious element can be adapted to the client's own belief system, making the framework flexible rather than exclusive. As for the objection that Heidegger's ontological analysis renders moral concerns obsolete, we can see that in practice, therapists often blend the ontological clearing with moral deliberation. When a client experiences the nothing that Heidegger describes, they are simultaneously confronted with the ethical weight of their choices, whether to pursue a career, to end a relationship, or to confront a personal trauma. The clearing does not erase morality, it sharpens it, forcing the individual to articulate values in the absence of default social scripts. In the broader cultural conversation, these philosophical perspectives help us make sense of collective anxieties that have surged in recent decades: climate change, pandemics, political upheaval. The anxiety we feel about a warming planet is not merely fear of a specific storm. It is a Kierkegaardian awareness that our collective freedom to shape the future is both boundless and terrifying. Heidegger would point to the way this anxiety reveals the nothingness of our current economic and political structures, urging a re-evaluation of what it means to be human in a world where the old certainties have dissolved. Sartre would remind us that we are condemned to be free, and thus must take responsibility for the choices that will determine the planet's fate. May and Frankl would suggest that we can transform this existential dread into meaning-making by channeling anxiety into activism, art, or community building. In this way, the philosophical lineage from Kierkegaard to contemporary psychology offers a roadmap for turning collective dread into purposeful action. Let us now consider a final, integrative analogy that ties together these threads. Imagine anxiety as a dimly lit lighthouse on a storm-tossed coast. Kierkegaard sees the lighthouse as a signal that the sailor, ourself, has the freedom to choose a course, but must also recognize the peril of the rocks hidden beneath the waves. Heidegger views the lighthouse as the moment when the fog lifts, revealing the sheer drop of the cliff into which the sailor could fall, an awareness of mortality that forces the sailor to confront the ultimate horizon. Sartre interprets the lighthouse as the reminder that the sailor is alone at the helm, responsible for steering, with no external captain to dictate the route. Finally, the existential humanistic psychologists see the lighthouse as a tool that can be repurposed. The sailor can use its beam not only to avoid danger, but to chart a new, meaningful destination, turning the anxiety of the storm into a compass for a purposeful voyage. This analogy captures how each thinker reframes the same phenomenon, anxiety, into a different yet complementary guide for authentic living. As we draw this comparative meditation to a close, let us return to the words that have anchored our exploration. Kierkegaard wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Heidegger whispered, "Anxiety is the being of Dasein that reveals the nothing." Sartre declared, "Man is condemned to be free," and Rollo may reminded us, "Anxiety is the signal that something is at stake, that something of value is in danger of being lost." In the quiet moments when these sentences echo in our minds, we are invited to sit with the unsettling awareness that our freedom, our finitude, and our responsibility are intertwined. We are called to recognize that anxiety is not a flaw to be cured, but a profound invitation to choose, to create, to give meaning to the finite time we have. May you carry this invitation forward, whether you are a veteran confronting the shadow of mortality, a teenager navigating the labyrinth of identity, or a therapist guiding a client toward a richer narrative. May you see anxiety not as a wall, but as a doorway that opens onto the vast landscape of human possibility. And may the conversation between Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Sartre, and modern psychology continue to illuminate the path, reminding us that in the midst of our deepest dread, there lies the seed of our most authentic self. Imagine for a moment that you are scrolling through a feed that never ends. Each swipe reveals another perfectly curated moment. A sunrise over a distant beach, a friend's spontaneous road trip, a colleague's promotion, a flash sale that will disappear in an hour. The images flicker, the notifications ping, the algorithm whispers, "You might also like this." And somewhere beneath the surface of this digital tide, a subtle but persistent unease begins to coil. It is not merely the stress of a looming deadline or the fatigue of a long day. It is a deeper, more unsettling sensation that philosophers have called anxiety, and that Søren Kierkegaard famously described as the dizziness of freedom. In this segment, we will trace how Kierkegaard's 19th-century insights illuminate the very real, very modern experience of anxiety in the digital age. How that anxiety ripples into climate dread and pandemic uncertainty, and how ethical responsibility and therapeutic practice might respond. Kierkegaard first articulated anxiety in his 1844 work The Concept of Anxiety, where he distinguished it from fear. Fear, he argued, has an object, a specific danger that can be identified and perhaps avoided. Anxiety, by contrast, is the dizziness of freedom, a feeling that arises precisely because we are confronted with the boundless possibilities that our freedom entails. He wrote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the trembling of the possibility of the possible." The word dizziness is not metaphorical. It captures the vertigo that accompanies the awareness that we can become anything, that every choice opens a new horizon while simultaneously closing others. In Kierkegaard's view, this is not a pathological flaw but a fundamental condition of human existence, a necessary prelude to authentic self-realization. Fast forward 2 centuries, and the architecture of our lives has been reshaped by screens, algorithms, and a relentless flow of information. The possibility of the possible has multiplied exponentially. Where Kierkegaard imagined a single individual standing before a crossroads, today we stand before an endless network of crossroads, each presented to us in real time, each promising a different version of ourselves. The phenomenon that sociologists call fear of missing out, or FOMO, is a perfect contemporary echo of Kierkegaard's dizziness. When we see a friend's photo from a concert we did not attend, or a travel blog from a distant city we have never visited, we are not merely jealous of the experience we lack. We feel a deeper tremor that our own life is narrowing, that the possibilities we might have pursued are slipping away. This is not simply a marketing-induced anxiety. It is the same existential tremor that Kierkegaard identified, now amplified by the immediacy of digital media. Consider a young professional named Maya. She checks her phone during a break and sees a colleague's story, a weekend hike in the mountains, a gourmet dinner, a new language class. The notification badge glows and she feels a tightness in her chest. She wonders, if I had chosen differently, could I be having those experiences? The anxiety she feels is not about the specific hike. It is about the awareness that her freedom to choose has already been exercised in a way that excludes other possibilities. She experiences the dizziness of realizing that each decision she makes, whether to stay late at work, to decline a social invitation, to scroll past a post, creates a cascade of unchosen paths that now lie beyond her reach. This is the digital manifestation of Kierkegaard's concept, a moment where freedom becomes a source of vertigo rather than empowerment. now shift the focus from individual screens to the collective sphere of climate activism. In recent years, a new form of anxiety has emerged, one that is not confined to personal loss but to planetary loss. Climate activists, from the schoolchildren marching for carbon neutrality to the indigenous leaders defending their lands, often describe a persistent dread that the future may become uninhabitable. Their anxiety is rooted in a recognition of the vast, open possibilities of human action, technological innovation, policy reform, cultural shift, paired with the terrifying prospect that these possibilities may not be realized. In Kierkegaardian terms, they are confronting the possibility of the possible on a planetary scale. The dread they feel is not merely fear of a specific storm, it is the existential anxiety of being aware that humanity's freedom to choose its path could lead to irreversible loss. When the activist Greta Thunberg spoke at the United Nations in 2019, she said, "I want you to act as if the house is on fire." Her words capture the urgency of a collective anxiety that demands action. Yet this anxiety also carries the weight of responsibility. Kierkegaard believed that anxiety, when embraced, can become a catalyst for authentic choice. He wrote, "Anxiety is the first and the last of the human conditions. It is both the beginning of our awareness of freedom and the final test of whether we will let that freedom lead us to authenticity or to avoidance." For climate activists, the anxiety is a call to authentic responsibility, to shape policies, to transform economies, to imagine a future that does not repeat the mistakes of the past. The ethical implications of this modern anxiety are profound. If anxiety is a signal that we are confronting the breadth of our freedom, then ignoring it, by numbing ourselves with endless scrolling, by dismissing climate data, by deferring policy decisions, constitutes an ethical failure. Kierkegaard famously asserted that the greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, is to become a mere function. In the digital age, we risk becoming mere functions of algorithms, of data points, of market forces. The ethical demand then is to reclaim agency, to pause, reflect, and choose deliberately, even when the possibilities overwhelm us. From a policy perspective, this ethical demand translates into concrete responsibilities for governments and institutions. Mental health funding, for instance, is not merely a budgetary line item. It is an acknowledgement that the structures of modern life, social media, economic precarity, climate uncertainty, generate a form of existential anxiety that requires societal support. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, many nations increased their mental health budgets, citing the surge in anxiety and depression. In 2020, a global mental health surge was reported by the World Health Organization, noting a 25% increase in anxiety disorders worldwide. In the accompanying research brief, scholars referenced existential philosophers, including Kierkegaard, to explain the sense of existential threat that pervaded populations coping with lockdowns, loss of routine, and the constant flow of distressing news. The brief quoted Kierkegaard's observation that the anxiety, which is the condition of possibility, is also the condition of the possibility of becoming a self. This citation was not merely academic. It shaped public discourse, prompting policymakers to consider not only clinical interventions, but also societal conditions that exacerbate existential dread. One historical anecdote that illustrates this intersection is the 2020 Mental Health and the Pandemic Symposium held virtually by the American Psychological Association. The keynote speaker, Dr. Maria Popova, opened with a reading from Kierkegaard's The Concept of Anxiety. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. She argued that the pandemic forced millions into a sudden confrontation with freedom, freedom from work, from social interaction, from the ordinary rhythms that provide a sense of stability. The audience, comprising clinicians, researchers, and policymakers, responded by framing mental health interventions not just as symptom relief, but as spaces where individuals could re-engage with their freedom in a meaningful way. This symposium sparked a series of policy proposals in several U.S. states to fund community-based programs that blend existential discussion groups with traditional therapy, a direct legacy of Kierkegaardian thought applied to contemporary crisis. A more recent anecdote involves the contemporary philosopher Simon Critchley, who, in a public lecture at the London School of Economics in 2022, invoked Kierkegaardian anxiety to critique the digital economy. Critchley opened with the line, "We are living in an age of perpetual possibility, and yet we feel more anxious than ever." He then quoted Kierkegaard. "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the trembling of the possibility of the possible." Critchley argued that the architecture of social media platforms, designed to maximize engagement by constantly presenting new possibilities, has turned the existential dizziness into a chronic, unrelenting state. He suggested that the solution lies not in shutting down technology, but in cultivating a philosophical pause, a moment of reflective distance that allows individuals to confront their freedom without being overwhelmed. His lecture was widely reported, and within weeks a coalition of digital rights activists used his arguments to lobby for regulations that would require platforms to provide well-being prompts after a certain number of continuous scrolls. This demonstrates how Kierkegaard's 19th-century insight can inspire concrete policy debates in the 21st century. Yet, not everyone agrees that Kierkegaard's framework is the appropriate lens for digital or climate anxiety. One line of criticism comes from scholars of technology who argue that the anxiety produced by digital media is fundamentally different from Kierkegaardian existential anxiety. They claim that digital anxiety is a product of information overload, algorithmic manipulation, and neurochemical responses to notifications, a neuropsychological phenomenon rather than a philosophical condition. Dr. Naomi Klein, a media psychologist, has written that the constant dopamine hits from likes and shares create a feedback loop that is more akin to addiction than to the existential dread Kierkegaard described. From this perspective, the dizziness is not about confronting the boundless possibilities of freedom, but about a physiological response to intermittent reinforcement. The critics suggest that treating digital anxiety through existential philosophy may overlook the need for technological design changes, such as limiting push notifications or redesigning interfaces to reduce compulsive scrolling. A second counterargument comes from social critics who view Kierkegaard's proposed solutions, namely the embrace of authentic choice and personal responsibility, as impractical in a mass society. They argue that Kierkegaard's emphasis on individual authenticity assumes a level of agency and freedom that many people lack, especially those living under economic precarity, systemic oppression, or authoritarian regimes. As political theorist Nancy Fraser has noted, the call to authentic self-realization can become a moral burden when structural conditions limit the very possibilities that authenticity presupposes. In other words, telling people to confront their anxiety by making authentic choices may inadvertently blame them for their suffering when the larger social and economic structures are the primary drivers of that anxiety. Critics thus contend that Kierkegaard's solutions risk individualizing what are, in many cases, collective problems. These critiques do not, however, nullify the relevance of Kierkegaard's insights. Rather, they invite a more nuanced integration of his ideas with contemporary understandings. For instance, mindfulness practices, originating in Buddhist traditions but widely adopted in Western therapeutic contexts, offer a method for grounding the individual in the present moment, thereby reducing the overwhelming sense of infinite possibility. When combined with Kierkegaardian reflection, mindfulness can help the individual recognize the dizziness without being swept away by it. In existential humanistic therapy, pioneered by figures like Rollo May and Viktor Frankl, the therapist encourages clients to explore the meaning behind their anxiety, to see it as a signal that they are confronting choices that matter. This therapeutic stance aligns closely with Kierkegaard's view that anxiety is a gateway to authentic selfhood. In practical terms, a therapist might ask a client who is overwhelmed by social media notifications to pause and ask, "What does this anxiety tell you about the possibilities you value?" The client may discover that the scrolling is a way of avoiding a deeper question about career direction, relationships, or personal values. By naming the anxiety, the client can begin to reorient their freedom toward a deliberate project, rather than being passively carried by the algorithm. This is precisely the kind of leap of faith Kierkegaard described, not a religious leap, but a leap into authentic decision-making in the face of uncertainty. Policy debates are also beginning to reflect this integration. In several European nations, mental health funding bills now include provisions for existential counseling within public health services. These programs train clinicians in existential humanistic approaches, encouraging them to help citizens articulate the values that underlie their anxiety, whether it stems from digital overload, climate dread, or pandemic uncertainty. In Canada, a recent parliamentary committee on mental health cited Kierkegaard's notion of anxiety as a cultural condition that must be addressed through both public education and structural reforms, such as regulating the time spent on social platforms for minors. The committee's report highlighted that recognizing anxiety as a symptom of freedom can shift policy from merely treating symptoms to fostering environments where authentic choice is possible. Let us return to the example of FOMO to see how these ideas play out. Imagine a teenager named Alex who spends hours each night scrolling through Instagram. Each post is a reminder of experiences not taken, friendships not deepened, skills not learned. The anxiety builds, and Alex feels a pressure to keep up. In a therapeutic setting informed by Kierkegaard, the practitioner would help Alex see that the anxiety signals a confrontation with freedom. The freedom to choose how to spend time, the freedom to define what matters. By exploring what truly resonates, perhaps a love for music, a desire for community service, Alex can transform the dizzying flood of possibilities into a focused project. The therapist might also suggest a digital fast, a deliberate period of disengagement, to give Alex space to hear the inner voice that is often drowned out by the algorithmic noise. Now consider a climate activist named Layla, who feels a heavy weight of collective anxiety as she organizes protests and writes policy briefs. Her anxiety is not personal in the narrow sense. It is a shared dread about the planet's future. Kierkegaard's insight that anxiety can be both individual and collective becomes crucial here. Layla's experience reflects what Heidegger later called being toward death on a planetary scale, but it also resonates with Kierkegaard's idea that anxiety is the possibility of the possible becoming present. In a group setting, Layla can channel that anxiety into purposeful action, turning dread into a motivating force for policy change. The ethical implication is clear. When anxiety is recognized as an authentic response to the openness of the future, it legitimizes the activist's urgency and demands that societies allocate resources, funding for renewable energy, support for climate-resilient communities, to address the underlying possibilities that generate the anxiety. In both cases, the ethical responsibility extends beyond the individual. If we accept that anxiety is a signal of freedom, then societies have an obligation to shape the conditions under which that freedom can be exercised responsibly. This means designing digital platforms that respect users' capacity for authentic choice rather than exploiting it. It means creating public policies that mitigate climate risk, thereby reducing the existential dread that stems from an unmanageable future. It means funding mental health services that incorporate existential reflection, not just symptom suppression. To illustrate the practical side of policy, let us look at a recent initiative in the Netherlands called Digital Well-Being in Schools. The program mandates that secondary schools allocate at least 1 hour per week to teach students about the philosophical dimensions of digital life, drawing on Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and contemporary thinkers like Simon Critchley. The curriculum includes reflective writing assignments, where students describe moments of digital anxiety and explore what those moments reveal about their values and choices. Early evaluations suggest that students who engage in this reflective practice report lower levels of FOMO and higher levels of perceived agency. This example shows how Kierkegaard's philosophical framework can be operationalized in educational policy, turning abstract concepts into concrete interventions. Similarly, in the realm of climate policy, the city of Copenhagen has launched a Future Scenarios Lab, a public forum where citizens, scientists, and policymakers co-create narratives about possible climate futures. Participants are encouraged to confront the anxiety of uncertainty, to articulate both their fears and hopes. The lab draws on existential humanistic principles, inviting participants to view anxiety not as a barrier, but as a catalyst for collective imagination. By acknowledging the dizziness of freedom, the lab helps citizens move from passive dread to active participation in shaping policy. This approach aligns with Kierkegaard's claim that anxiety, when faced head-on, can lead to authentic choice and ultimately to the creation of a self or a society grounded in its own possibilities. Of course, the skeptics we mentioned earlier will point out that such initiatives may be idealistic. They will ask, can a brief classroom discussion truly counteract the relentless pull of algorithmic design? Can a public forum genuinely empower citizens when corporate interests dominate climate negotiations? The answer, perhaps, lies in recognizing that Kierkegaard did not promise a quick fix. He understood anxiety as a condition that persists, that resurfaces whenever we encounter freedom. He wrote, "Anxiety is the first and the last of the human conditions." The goal, then, is not to eradicate anxiety, but to cultivate a relationship with it that allows for growth. In therapeutic practice, this means integrating mindfulness to calm the nervous system, while simultaneously engaging in existential reflection to give the anxiety meaning. In policy, it means creating structures that provide space for reflection, such as mandatory digital well-being curricula, public deliberation spaces, and accessible mental health services, while also addressing the systemic sources of anxiety, like platform design and climate inaction. Let us pause now to consider a direct quotation from Kierkegaard that encapsulates this dual approach. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the trembling of the possibility of the possible, and yet it is also the ground upon which the self is built. When we hear this, we can imagine the anxiety not as a flaw to be patched, but as a foundation on which we can construct a more authentic life. In the digital age, this foundation can be fortified by mindful pauses, moments where we deliberately step away from the scrolling, where we ask ourselves what we truly value beyond the next notification. In the climate arena, it can be fortified by collective action that transforms dread into concrete projects, renewable energy cooperatives, community gardens, policy advocacy groups. In therapeutic practice, it can be fortified by integrating existential humanistic techniques that help clients articulate the meanings behind their anxiety and choose actions aligned with those meanings. The integration of Kierkegaard's insights with contemporary concerns also invites cross-references to other philosophical traditions. For instance, the Buddhist concept of dukkha, often translated as suffering, shares an awareness of the unsatisfactory nature of clinging to fixed narratives. Yet Buddhist practice emphasizes non-attachment rather than authentic choice. By juxtaposing the two, we can see that mindfulness offers a method for calming the physiological arousal of anxiety, while Kierkegaard provides a narrative framework for interpreting the existential significance of that anxiety. In practice, a therapist might guide a client through a mindfulness exercise to observe the breath, then transition to an existential dialogue. What does this breath tell you about the possibilities you're confronting? This synthesis respects both the body's need for calm and the mind's need for meaning. Similarly, the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who built upon Kierkegaard's notion of freedom, famously declared that existence precedes essence. Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom and responsibility resonates with Kierkegaard's anxiety as the dizziness that precedes authentic self-creation. Yet Sartre's later political activism illustrates how this freedom can be directed toward collective emancipation, a point that aligns with our discussion of climate activists. By weaving together Kierkegaard, Sartre, and contemporary thinkers like Critchley, we can trace a lineage of thought that moves from the individual's inner turmoil to the societal structures that shape and are shaped by that turmoil. In terms of concrete therapeutic tools, existential humanistic therapy often employs techniques such as the death counsel exercise, where clients contemplate mortality to sharpen their sense of purpose. While this may sound morbid, it directly engages the anxiety of possibility that Kierkegaard described. By confronting the ultimate limit, death, clients can clarify which possibilities truly matter. In the digital context, this might translate into a digital mortality exercise. Imagine that all your online profiles, likes, and followers disappear tomorrow. What would you miss? What would remain meaningful? Such an exercise can help individuals differentiate between superficial possibilities, the endless stream of content, and deeper, authentic projects, relationships, creative work, civic engagement. On the policy front, mental health funding debates increasingly reference the need for preventive as well as reactive measures. In the United States, the recent Mental Health Innovation Act proposes grants for community centers that combine digital literacy workshops with existential counseling. The rationale is that by teaching people how algorithms work, and simultaneously providing a philosophical framework for interpreting anxiety, we can reduce the prevalence of chronic digital distress. Critics of the bill argue that resources would be better spent on medication or crisis hotlines. However, proponents counter that without addressing the underlying existential dimension, any symptom-focused intervention will be merely a band-aid. Returning to our earlier examples, let us examine how the fear of missing out can be reframed through Kierkegaardian insight. When Alex feels the pull of endless possibilities on Instagram, the anxiety is a signal that Alex's freedom is being stretched thin. The ethical response is not to simply limit screen time, though that is a helpful step, but to encourage Alex to articulate a personal project that gives direction to that freedom. Perhaps Alex discovers a passion for photography and decides to allocate an hour each day to practice, rather than scrolling aimlessly. The anxiety, once acknowledged, becomes a compass pointing toward a chosen path. The digital platform in this view is not the enemy but the terrain that reveals the need for authentic navigation. For Layla, the climate activist, the collective anxiety can be harnessed through what Kierkegaard might call the leap of faith into the possible. Layla's community organizes a series of future vision workshops where participants imagine both catastrophic and hopeful climate scenarios. By confronting the worst-case possibilities, participants experience a heightened anxiety that, rather than immobilizing them, spurs concrete policy proposals, such as a municipal green bond initiative. The workshops are facilitated by existential humanistic counselors who help participants articulate the personal values underlying their activism, ensuring that the collective anxiety does not dissolve into despair, but remains a motivating force for policy change. In both cases, we see a pattern: anxiety as a diagnostic tool, a signal that something in the realm of possibilities demands attention. The ethical implication is that societies must create spaces, educational, therapeutic, political, where individuals can safely encounter that signal, interpret it, and act upon it. This is the essence of Kierkegaard's call for authenticity, translated into the language of the digital age. To close this exploration, let us revisit one of Kierkegaard's most poignant lines from the concept of anxiety. Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, the trembling of the possibility of the possible. It is the awareness that the possibilities that lie before us are not merely given, but are ours to choose, and that in choosing we become ourselves. In the swirling currents of social media feeds, in the looming specter of climate change, in the lingering uncertainty of a post-pandemic world, this awareness remains as vital as ever. It reminds us that the anxiety we feel is not a malfunction to be eliminated, but a call to engage with the freedom that defines our humanity. Thus, the modern relevance of Kierkegaard's philosophy lies not in offering a simple cure for digital overload, but in providing a lens through which we can understand why that overload feels so unsettling. It invites us to ask in a calm and reflective voice what possibilities we truly value, how we might responsibly shape the digital environments that present them, and how we can collectively address the anxieties that arise from the planetary challenges we face. By integrating mindfulness to steady the nervous system, existential humanistic therapy to give anxiety meaning, and public policy to ensure the structures of freedom are just and supportive, we honor both the depth of Kierkegaard's insight and the urgency of our contemporary moment. In the end, the task before us is both personal and communal. Each of us must learn to sit with the dizziness, to recognize it as the tremor of freedom, and to decide, perhaps slowly, perhaps courageously, what direction to steer our lives. At the same time, we must demand from our institutions the space, the resources, and the ethical frameworks that allow that freedom to be exercised without crushing us under its weight. In doing so, we transform anxiety from a paralyzing dread into a catalyst for authentic living, for responsible digital citizenship, and for a hopeful engagement with the future of our planet. The journey is long, the possibilities vast, and the anxiety real, but within that very anxiety lies the seed of the self we are invited to become.